is that I should have taken my hat off. That's what I do. How's my comb over? Am I getting away with it? I should put my hat back. Ow! So, okay, so the thesis of the book essentially is that our government got us into this mess in the first place. Then they made matters worse. And their story that the bad guys, the radical Islamist, fundamentalist, terrorists, attack us because of who we are, because of who they are, makes them hate who we are, is a load of crap. They couldn't tell the truth that this was all their fault, so they told the lie that it wasn't, and that now we had to begin our defensive war against them. That was 20 years ago. Somewhere on the order of 2 million people who didn't attack us, had nothing to do with the attack on our country, have been killed in the meantime. Between 35 and 40 million refugees have been forced from their homes. The worst refugee crisis since World War II, unbelievably. And the whole thing continues on. Joe Biden is the first president to run since George W. Bush, or since Bill Clinton, actually, because Bush did, including Bush, to not run on ending wars. He did said he wanted to scale back the war in Yemen, which he's done. But essentially, he ran on the lie that Donald Trump was an isolationist, and now we need to recommit to American internationalism and interventionism. Bush, Obama, and Trump at least lied and pretended like they wanted to scale things back, or at least Bush knew he was lying. I think Obama and Trump actually did kind of want to, but they found that the Pentagon is far more powerful than any president when it comes to that kind of thing. But anyway, so that's the basic thesis of the thing. And here's essentially how it goes. In 79, Jimmy Carter was the president. That summer, they authorized the beginning of CIA support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The express purpose of this was to provoke the Soviets into invading. The American people had what was called the Vietnam Syndrome, this mental illness that they didn't want to send their last son to go die like they had the previous war in Vietnam. And so the thinkers in the Carter administration said, you know, if we can't contain communism by getting the American people on board for these proxy wars around the world, maybe we can bait them into overexpansion. And if Vietnam hurt us so bad, we got a syndrome over it, maybe we can do that to the Russians. And that was their specific words. We'll give them their own Vietnam. And that was why they started supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, to provoke the Russians into invading, which they did Christmas 79. Although, whatever's doing that, if someone could turn that off, help me. I got short-term memory problems here for some reason. But so I got what Joe Biden's got for sure. And early onset, I'll tell you what. I'm under a lot more stress than him. He's doing all his work for him. So in 79, so they invaded in right around Christmas or December 79. But it's not really correct. I don't think that it was the American intervention that had really provoked it. Their own sock puppet dictator was causing such problems that the first thing the KGB did was kill him and replace him. And so, but regardless, that was still their intent, and there's still an important lesson there. And then once the Soviets invaded, of course, they spent the rest of the Carter years and all through the Ronald Reagan years supporting the Mujahideen against the Russians to bog them down and bleed them to bankruptcy. And as the Reaganites admitted, it worked better than they thought it would. They thought that they could probably, help the Mujahideen hold the Russians off. Here, they not only defeated them, but they helped bring down the whole Soviet Union. The troops were pulled out in 1989, between the time that the wall started coming down in Berlin and the final end of the Soviet Union in 1991. And it was widely agreed that it was the war in Afghanistan was one of the straws that broke the Soviet camel's back. And then the oil price crash of the late 1980s finished the job. Okay. Also in 1979 was the revolution in Iran, where essentially the American sock puppet dictator was dying of cancer and was weakened. And so his regime was overthrown in a broad-based popular revolution where eventually, well, pretty much from the beginning, the Shiite Ayatollahs seized power, Ayatollah Khomeini. And you might have wondered, if he was in exile in France, I remember seeing the footage when I was a kid of him getting on the plane in Paris, France, to go home to Iran to inherit the revolution. And I remember wondering, well, why would the French put him on the plane? Wouldn't they check with DC and see if that was a good idea first? Of course, it was the Americans who told him to do that. The CIA and the State Department told Jimmy Carter, oh, the Ayatollah Khomeini, we know him. He's our friend from 1953 when he helped agitate to overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh in our CIA-backed coup back then. We can get along with him, no problem. And in fact, they did get along with him. And they sent the Ayatollah's new regime intelligence warning about Russian and Iraqi threats all through 1979. See, it's a mistake of popular memory that the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis broke out at the same time. It actually was 9 months later in November, or 10 months later in November of 1979 was when David Rockefeller convinced Jimmy Carter to let the Shah into the United States for cancer treatment. And the people of Iran took that as a signal that we were going to do a coup and overthrow the government and try to reinstall him. And so that was when the riot broke out and the hostage embassy crisis. And everybody always conflates that together, but it goes to show that even after the Iranian Revolution, we lost our guy, but we still had a decent enough relationship with the new government that could have been okay. Our friends, the Israelis, kept their relationship with the Iranians all the way through the 1980s. When America was backing Saddam Hussein's war against them, the Israelis were on the other side. They didn't decide that radical Islam was a big threat until 1993 when the Soviet Union was gone and they needed a new big threat. Glue for the alliance, new glue for the alliance between America and Israel. So then they decided the Ayatollah was a problem. And then also, of course, in 1980, it counts as 79, it's the very beginning of 1980, Saddam Hussein, with a green light from Jimmy Carter, invaded Iran. And he did so, this was part of the Carter Doctrine. I skipped a part, sorry. Once the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, which the Carter government had tried to provoke, then they panicked and said, oh no, they could invade Iran next and threaten the Persian Gulf. And so then Carter said, no, now we have a Carter Doctrine that says the Persian Gulf is an American lake. And anyone else who tries to dominate the Persian Gulf will treat it as an attack on the United States, meaning a warning to the Russians that they could get into a nuclear war with us if they invaded Iran. It wasn't even our ally at the time, just to keep them away. And then when they support Saddam Hussein had his own problem with the Iraqi Shiite supermajority in the country. That once there was a sectarian revolution in Iran, there was a real question whether the Iraqi Shiite supermajority were going to choose their religious sect or their ethnic, as Arabs as opposed to Persians, and national sectarianism. And the answer was, of course, all three, right? And some Shiites went to Iran to enjoy the revolution, to take part in it, and some hoped to import it into Iraq immediately. And this is why Saddam Hussein then conscripted them and sent them to war against Iran to prevent that. And he thought it would be easy. This happens, these guys think their wars will be easy. And it wasn't. It was essentially a World War I type stalemate, trench warfare type battle. Something like 500,000 people killed on each side in a war that lasted all the way through the 1980s. And of course, Reagan continuing all of these policies. All right, but then here's the rub. At the end of the Iran-Iraq war, Saddam Hussein had a dispute with the Kuwaitis over war debts. And I get into detail in the book, but suffice to say, they might as well have deliberately entrapped him into invading Kuwait. And maybe they did. I think they probably didn't. But they let him know that they wouldn't mind if he did. And then the British changed Bush Sr.'s mind after the fact, is the reason we even had Iraq War I. James Baker and George Bush were going to let Saddam get away with it. Even he was supposed to only take the northern oil fields. And even after he took the whole country, they didn't care. Even Bob Woodward's book, The Commander, says the night of the invasion, they had decided that we're drawing the line at Saudi Arabia. As long as he doesn't come south into Saudi, we're fine. And it wasn't until Margaret Thatcher said to George Bush in front of a bunch of reporters, well, you're not going to go wobbly on me now, are you, Bush? Which meant you're not less of a man than a woman, are you? And so Bush said, no, this will not stand. And spent the rest of the year 1990 refusing to negotiate with Saddam Hussein, his employee from a few weeks before, because Hussein wanted out. He just needed to save a little bit of face, and they wouldn't let him do it. They had to have their war. Once they started building up, there's no stopping it. But this is the real problem was they had to expand the American bases in Saudi Arabia. And in the aftermath And they had promised the king, King Fahd, that they would leave as soon as the war was over, no problem. But when the war was over, the Shiite supermajority of the Iraqi South and East rose up to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And George Bush encouraged it. They dropped leaflets, the Air Force dropped leaflets, and George Bush Sr. put out a speech over Voice of America, encouraging the Shiites and the Kurds to rise up. Now's your chance to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And they took him up on it. They thought that America would support them. The Americans occupied the entire south of Iraq at the time. But then they changed their mind. And General Schwarzkopf made a deliberate decision, or, from above him, but made the deal with Saddam Hussein. He was allowed to keep X number of tanks and his attack helicopters that he used then to mercilessly suppress this insurrection and kill somewhere on the order of 100,000 Shiites and Kurds to do so. The Bush government then said, well, now we have to stay in Saudi Arabia to protect those that we just encouraged to rise up and then betrayed. And the reason the Bush government had betrayed them was because they were afraid. They realized that, we have Iraqi militias based in Iran coming across the border to lead the revolution. We just spent 8 years under Ronald Reagan, 10 years, under Carter, Reagan, and Bush, supporting Saddam to contain the Iranian revolution. Now we're importing it into Iran. So that was why they called it off and let Saddam kill them all. Then they said, well, now we have to stay to protect the Shiite majority in the South. And they launched what they call their no-fly zones with France and Britain, and France dropped out pretty quick. And then for the rest of the Clinton years, all through the 1990s, the Americans bombed the Iraqis from bases in Saudi Arabia. And this is what made the Mujahideen from the Afghan war turn against the United States. There's also American support for Israel in their occupations in Palestine and at that time in southern Lebanon. And so the guys who had been Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan's freedom fighters in Afghanistan, which I should have mentioned before, included a lot of Arabs and even Americans and people from all over the world to go and travel to join the Mujahideen to fight in Afghanistan. They called them the Arab Afghan Army. So it wasn't Afghans who attacked us. It was Saudi and Egyptian dissidents who were angry at the United States for being too close to their governments, for supporting their governments. And if you look at the attackers against the United States all through the 1990s, from the assassination of Rabbi Kahane in 1990 to the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, the attack on U.S. personnel training Saudi National Guardsmen in 1995, the Khobar Towers in 96, the Africa embassies in 98, the USS Cole in 2000, and then up through September 11th. All of the attackers were from countries friendly to the United States. They weren't from Iran, Iraq, and Syria, the axis of evil that Israel doesn't like and you're supposed to hate. None of them were Shiites. None of them. They were radicals from the states that America dominates in the U.S. order, Sunni king order in the Middle East. And that was why they attacked the United States. But it wasn't just revenge. They stated explicitly over and over again through the 1990s that the reason that they were doing this was they had a strategy, is they were trying to provoke an overreaction, as Saul Alinsky said, with all asymmetric political action. The real benefit comes in the reaction of the opposition. So how's a group of 400 exiled Arabs living on the Afghan-Pakistan border, how are they supposed to take down the United States of America? It's crazy and stupid. In fact, John Miller, who was an ABC News reporter who had interviewed bin Laden in 98, later said that when bin Laden told him, yeah, that's why me and my guys are going to war against you, that internally, I guess not to his face, but he laughed and, scoffed to himself. Yeah, you and what army, pal? But the answer is the U.S. Army, the U.S. Marine Corps, Navy, and Air Force. They're the ones who are going to accomplish all of bin Laden's goals. First and foremost, bleeding us to bankruptcy in the Soviet style and forcing us out of the Middle East the long and the hard way eventually, and the day is coming. And in the meantime, though, destabilizing and disrupting the entire Middle Eastern order, radicalizing everyone's politics, everyone's religious beliefs, and creating essentially fertile ground for the kind of caliphate that, believe it or not, actually did rise up there in Syria and Iraq in 2014 through 17 there. And they could have never done that themselves. He's talking about 400 bandits exiled as far as you can get from anywhere before you're on your way back again the other way. And it took the Americans taking the bait. And in the book, in both books actually, I quote Omar bin Laden, Osama's non-terrorist son. It's Hamza who's the terrorist. Omar bin Laden gave an interview to Rolling Stone in 2010 in Syria. And he said, look, in Clinton's time, you guys sent cruise missiles after my father. Oh, this is 2010, so bin Laden was still alive for another year at this point. He says, Bill Clinton sent missiles after my father and didn't get them, but you guys have invaded the entire country and you still haven't gotten them. And so in Clinton's time, you're very smart, not like the bull that runs after the red scarf. And he explained, again, to reiterate over and over, that this was what bin Laden was planning. And so after 20 years of war in Afghanistan, probably about $3 trillion spent there, hundreds of thousands of people killed. We're leaving. If it's not in May, it'll be this fall or sometime sooner than later. Even in Washington, D.C., not in the Pentagon and not at the CIA, but in the Congress and, in politics, people are sick and tired of the Afghan war. It's time to end the thing. And we're leaving, putting the Taliban right back in power where they were after fighting 20 years for essentially nothing and wasting all those lives for essentially nothing, and which is exactly what bin Laden always wanted. But here's the real rub. The former chief of the CIA's bin Laden unit, Michael Scheuer, said that Bush's invasion of Iraq was the hoped for but unexpected gift to bin Laden. If Afghanistan is all he ever wanted, this is his dream come true, because now you're moving the battlefield 2,000 miles east, 1,500 miles west, pardon me, sorry, stage right here, 1,500 miles, into Mesopotamia and into the Levant, and create this massive sectarian war against the man that bin Laden called the socialist infidel, Saddam Hussein, who worshipped himself, wore a French beret, shaved his chin every morning, wore olive green fatigues like a Western military dictator. This is why he'd gotten along so well with Reagan and Bush in the past. Carter, Reagan, and Bush in the past. And we all know roughly the aftermath of that war. Junior picked up where his father left off and imported the Iranian Revolution into Iraq. And they now rule Baghdad. Fought a 5-year civil war for them against the Sunni minority, which pushed the Sunni minority into the arms of al-Qaeda and working with al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is the most brutal part of the Sunni insurgency that fought the Americans and slaughtered Shiite civilians and the rest. And but then back to Scheuer's point, if Afghanistan is all bin Laden ever wanted and Iraq was his hoped for but unexpected gift, then what does it mean when we go on and overthrow Gaddafi in Libya, do this half regime change in Syria, which leads to the rise of the Islamic State in eastern Syria and western Iraq, and then the regime change against Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, which has led to a war directly on behalf in Libya, Syria, and Yemen. All three of these wars are fought directly on behalf of the bin Ladenites against secular dictators. So that's more than every member of al-Qaeda winning the lottery, right? This is better than they could have ever dreamed could happen. And it wasn't because George Bush is stupid, although George Bush is stupid. But that's not what it was. Bin Laden was counting on him to be cynical, right? A lot of times people get mad at me when I say this, like Bush is innocent, that he got duped into this. I sure didn't mean to imply that. The point is that bin Laden could take one look at George W. Bush and see that this guy's guilty as hell before he even has a chance. He's such a cynic. He's going to exploit any crisis I hand him. And that's what Omar bin Laden had told Rolling Stone, that in the summer of 2000, my father was rooting for George W. Bush. He didn't see a big, tough, Texas cowboy. I'm afraid of this guy. He's going to fight back and commit violence against me and my boys. I don't want that. He saw the perfect mark. Here's a pretend tough guy, never really been in a fight in his life, right? Who will take the crisis that I hand him and exploit it to the ends of the earth in his overreaction, and that will accomplish all of my ends. In fact, Wall Street Journal reporter named Alan Cullison got a computer in Kabul right after the war started in 2001 that had a letter that bin Laden had emailed to Mullah Omar saying, I know this looks really bad right now. Oh, Mullah Omar was the leader of the Taliban government in Kabul. So I know this looks really bad right now, but trust me, in 10 years, the Americans will be broken and gone. Okay, it's been 20, but he's still right. And this goes to show essentially like the Leninist outlook of Osama bin Laden too, right? That he's willing to have as many Afghans, Iraqis, Syrians, Yemenis, or anyone else killed just as much as the Americans are. Let Allah sort them out. You got to break a few eggs to make an omelet and this kind of thing, as long as he gets what he wants in the end. And as my old friend Jeff Huber, who's a great writer for antiwar.com, wrote in 2011, after the Navy SEALs finally went and got him in Pakistan, he wrote, Osama bin Laden, dead and loving it. And he starts out the article, he says, eat your heart out, Charlemagne, et tu, Caesar, and how do you like them apples, Alexander? Because here's the greatest military strategist and tactician in the history of the world, hiding in the attic from his own wife, doesn't even have an army of his own to command at all. And yet he can move all of the most powerful military forces of the most powerful governments on the planet at will to theater after theater, bogging us down in what he called these goat rope missions, fighting essentially Minutemen in their own neighborhoods on a fool's errand to accomplish nothing at all. There's nothing like it in history that compares. And yes, it's true that his marks were all very willing. And yet, essentially, they've been playing from Osama bin Laden's screen directions this whole time. And so that's why bin Laden didn't mind dying in 2011. He didn't think he was going to end up being the king of Saudi Arabia someday. He knew who was going to die in this thing. But boy, did he live long enough after Bush let him escape at Tora Bora, and after, and it didn't do a thing to try to find him for the rest of his 8 years in power there, 7 years in power after that. Yeah, sorry, that thing distracted me. It's that thing's fault. I can't remember what I was going to say. But anyway, the point is that, so here we are, it's 2021, and we spent approximately $7 trillion, right around that. We lost 4,500 American soldiers and another probably, 2,000 or 3,000 mercenaries and other contractors. Not all contractors are mercenaries. Some of them are just truck drivers and, regular people over there. And we've accomplished absolutely nothing for it, except I guess you could say, and, I don't mean this just like to be sarcastic or whatever. I think it's true that one thing that society has gained is, severe advancements in the technology of prosthetic limbs, because of so many of our soldiers and Marines have had their legs, their arms, and more blown off. But then the technology is such that their lives are saved. They don't bleed out. Their lives are saved, but now they got no limbs. And so now we've got, Luke Skywalker style artificial hands 20 years ahead of schedule. But it seems like that $7 trillion probably could have been invested in hand technology and other things too. But what do I know? And now, if you read an article anywhere that agrees with me, that says it's time to call off the war on terrorism, it's time to get the troops out of Afghanistan, almost invariably, it'll say at the bottom, that way we can focus on picking a fight with China. Well, you know what? That's completely wrong. In fact, the policy of American dominance in the Middle East has always been about the Cold War with Russia and China that never ended this whole time anyway. Dominance of those oil supplies, especially in terms of dealing with China, is a threat to them. It also helps us maintain a hold over our East Asian allies. Korea, Japan, and Australia, and India, for that matter, are all very dependent on that Middle Eastern oil. So having control over that, especially in the case of a war with China, means that we can cut their energy supplies off. They have very little domestic oil resources in that vast country, surprisingly. And so that's kind of what this has always been about, except that if you forget all of the propaganda from just the last couple of years and think back to what you actually know about China, they're our second biggest trading partner after Canada. We've been at peace with them since our Cold War even has ended with them almost 50 years ago now. In 1974, when Kissinger and Nixon went and shook hands with Mao Zedong, quantifiably the worst human being who ever lived. And they said, this is smart for us to make friends with the Chinese. And now we want to go back on that just because some aircraft carrier salesmen and some B-1 bomber salesmen think that it's a good idea when they don't have, what, because the Chinese are disputing some islands that the Japanese claim in some sea you've never heard of and don't care about. The whole thing is just a racket, guys. Again, this is what bin Laden was counting on, was that the American system is so corrupt that the vested interests in keeping the war going have such control over our system that they will run it all the way into the ground. And so you think the war on terrorism is bad? Try losing Los Angeles and San Francisco and Denver and maybe New York City and Austin, Texas to H-bombs and make the terror war look like a nice vacation. And the Chinese, I don't know if you guys saw this, some admiral was testifying last week, and Tom Cotton says, isn't it true that the Chinese could overmatch our nuclear capabilities within only 10 years? And he says, yes, they sure could, Senator, if they quadrupled their force. But then that wasn't even right. They'd have to, what do you call it when you 16-tuple somebody's nuclear force? That's what they would have to do. The Chinese have 200 nukes, 200 or 300 nukes, just enough to deter. They don't have anything like the United States of America's nuclear capability or submarines that dominate every ocean on the planet, the rest of this stuff. No, China is not even trying to overmatch the United States in nuclear capability. And when they spin narratives like that, I mean, the lesson to all of us should simply be of their dishonesty, who these men are and who it is they serve. It certainly isn't us. And that's about all I got to say about that. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Scott.
Okay. Who's up? Got one? Yeah.
Yeah. When the first Gulf War started, it was like the leaflets I did hear about. U.S. intentions that they wanted to go to Baghdad, I did hear about. I heard that the reasoning, though, why they didn't go to Baghdad is because the first Gulf War was a United Nations.
Yeah, that's correct. So it's two different things here. So first of all, the coalition mandate was simply to get Iraq out of Kuwait. And Bush Sr. said, hey, that's the mandate. We're doing that. And Colin Powell and the rest of them agreed, because if they went all the way to Baghdad at that point, then first of all, whatever large percentage of the UN members who had participated in the war would all drop out of the coalition. It would be a real scandal because it would have been a real bait and switch that they had promised they were just doing one thing. And then I think they were kind of thinking, oh, cool, we can get away with it. We'll just have the Shiites go all the way to Baghdad for us. We won't do it. And then somebody popped up and said, hey, the Iranians are coming across the border to lead this thing. And we're really reversing the last 8 years, 10 years of supporting Saddam to contain Iran. And so now, oops, we better call it off. And so that's what happened there. But there's a great quote from Dick Cheney from 1994. Because see, Wolfowitz and Bill Kristol and all of these guys have put forward this narrative about how Bush Sr. was such a wimp. And it's actually probably true, right? That he had this huge victory, 90% approval rating as of spring 1991. But by the fall of 1992, he lost. And W. Bush had learned this lesson. And Bill Kristol and the neoconservatives had, really pushed it this way. That if we'd still been in the middle of a war, he would have won. And he blew his hero status, blew that wad too early. And so then the lesson was, you got to be in the middle of a war to make sure you get reelected, was something that George W. Bush had said. In fact, I have the direct quote in the new book, where he, when he was still the governor of Texas, he told his authorized biographer, Mickey Herskowitz, if I have a chance to attack Iraq, that's exactly what I'm going to do, because, the lesson was my dad lost because the war was already over. You got to be in the middle of a war to get 2 terms. And it's blatant. It's right there. Yeah. And then this is how I was a conspiracy kind of nut at the time, but this was actually just pretty blatant. In the late 1990s, say 98, at least 99, when it was talked about that George W. Bush is going to run for president here. I remember, I didn't know who he was or why it mattered, but I remember seeing Bill Kristol on TV saying, well, of course, once George W. Bush is the president, he will have to go back to war with Iraq in his first term. Otherwise, he's risking the family legacy. and the same embarrassment that his father suffered, losing after one term while Saddam Hussein was still in power. And George W. Bush won't be able to risk that. He will have to attack Iraq in his first term. And I says, boy, you know what? That makes a lot of sense to me. And I didn't know who Crystal was. He was clearly relishing this, that, you know, there's going to be no way around it. He's going to have to do it. And so he's our guy. You know, that was the way they looked at it. Oh, and I'm sorry, I was going to say Dick Cheney, and everyone can look this up. Dick Cheney, 1994, C-SPAN. He's at the American Enterprise Institute. And a guy asked him, should we have gone all the way to Baghdad? And Cheney says, absolutely not. You know why? Because the Iranians would have got the east, and then the Syrians would have got the west, which that wasn't really right. The Assads didn't want to dominate Western Iraq, although that kind of was a portent of the future Islamic State there. And then he said, you know, then the Turks will have a problem with the independent Kurds up in the north, and the Turks have been our allies since World War II. And so we just decided, is it worth it? Or how many American soldiers' lives would it be worth to get Saddam Hussein? And we decided not very damn many, and we're glad that we decided what we decided. And then so just 6-7 years later, he comes in and does exactly what he thought would happen, essentially, especially in the part about empowering Iran in the south and the east of the country. And of course, has refused to take responsibility for any of that the whole time. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think the chances are that any president could actually? What do you think the chances are that any president, if he had the balls, could actually, you know, get us out of all these entanglements?
I think any president could if he had the courage to do so. The reality is,
his life, right?
you know, Barack Obama and Donald Trump both, for example, wanted out of Afghanistan, and the Pentagon just refused. Now, you guys remember Donald Trump tried to get us out of Syria in 2018 and 19, and they just said, belay that order. Forget you. We're not doing it. And then they said, well, you know what we'll do? We'll reduce it down to just a couple of hundred troops. And then on the way out, James Jeffrey did an interview with Defense News where he said, oh, yeah, we just lied to the president all the time and told him there were only a couple of hundred troops, and there are a lot more than that. And but, you know, whose fault is that, right? Okay, so here's Gareth Porter's great news story at the Gray Zone. Is about Colonel McGregor, who is the hero of the great tank battle of Iraq War I, and is known as the most serious and intelligent military strategist in America. After losing the election, Trump hired a guy named Christopher Miller, who had been a Green Beret from the Counterterrorism Center, and he hired Douglas McGregor to be his special advisor. And essentially the idea was, we have a couple of months here, let's see what we can do. And Gareth Porter reported now that Douglas McGregor wrote up an order that said we will have all troops out of Afghanistan by December 31st. That's it, full order. And McGregor wrote it up, and he made sure that the guys in the White House put it on the right kind of paper, that it was a presidential decision directive of the right category and everything to make sure it was perfect. They put it in front of the president. The president was delighted and signed it. And then the next day, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the head of CENTCOM came to him and said, you're not doing this. You can't do this. And he said, oh, okay, guys, and backed down. And then that was it. And at that point, he wasn't even facing impeachment. So, you know, they said that he wimped out on pardoning Assange because Mitch McConnell and the others were threatening that maybe they'd convict him if he did that, right? But this is all pre-January 6th, so there wasn't a question of him being impeached again at this point. So it wasn't that. He had essentially nothing to fear, but he just rolled over anyway. And Barack Obama did the same thing in 2009. When Obama ran for president, he said, I'm going to send a couple more brigades. And once he got in there, they said, no, you're going to give us 70,000 more troops, maybe 80, maybe 90. And he's like, man. And then he fought them, and they fought him all through the year 2009. And then finally in November 2009, he rolled over. At one point, according to Bob Woodward's book, Obama's Wars, at one point, Obama almost said, forget it, I'm just going to pull them all out. And then I guess Rahm Emanuel and his other staff said, if you do that, then Gates and Petraeus and McChrystal are going to all resign and accuse you of being a lousy commander-in-chief and all of this. And they'll accuse you of being weak. And so what did he do? He rolled over. Instead of being strong and telling them, screw you, I'm the president, not you. Instead of giving a speech called, hey, a year ago, I beat John McCain by 10 points because you people wanted me to make these decisions and not him. So screw you, Senator. We're not doing the surge. And then he would have been an alpha dog, right? No. Instead, he rolled over so that he looked tough. and escalated the war that he knew could not possibly succeed. And Donald Trump did the same thing. Donald Trump ordered American troops out of Afghanistan in March of 2017. Before they even named the special counsel, he was ordering troops out of Afghanistan. And then by the end of August, he ordered an escalation of 10,000 more troops and a massive increase in the air war that then reigned for the next 4 years. Killed tens of thousands more people for nothing. Sorry, my answers are so long. I'm supposed to be wrapping this up, right?
We gotta wrap it up. Yeah, we're gonna have to wrap it up. Sorry, guys.
Okay. Thank you guys for listening. Appreciate it. Buy the book. It's available now.